Sometimes the most powerful person on the street is the one nobody bothers to recognize. The Saturday morning sun hung low above a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Richmond, Virginia, casting long golden shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and freshly watered flower beds. The air smelled faintly of cut grass, and the peaceful rhythm of the weekend had settled comfortably over the community. In the driveway of a large but modest home, Marcus Bennett stood beside a black SUV with a garden hose in one hand and a sponge in the other. Water flowed smoothly across the vehicle's polished surface, reflecting flashes of sunlight like liquid glass. At 52 years old, Marcus carried himself with quiet confidence. His dark skin glowed beneath the morning light, and his calm expression revealed nothing about the responsibilities he carried every day. Dressed in faded jeans, work boots, and a simple gray t-shirt, he looked like any other homeowner enjoying a slow weekend morning. Across the street, a few neighbors worked in their yards while others relaxed on front porches with coffee mugs in hand. It was the kind of neighborhood where people noticed unfamiliar cars almost immediately. Marcus continued washing the SUV, paying little attention to the occasional glance from passing pedestrians. He enjoyed moments like these. They were rare opportunities to step away from meetings, paperwork, and leadership decisions. Here, standing beneath the open sky with nothing more complicated than soap and water, he could simply be himself. The distant hum of an approaching engine gradually grew louder. A marked police cruiser turned onto the street and slowed as it approached Marcus's property. The vehicle continued forward for several yards before coming to a stop near the curb directly in front of the house. Several nearby neighbors instinctively looked up. One woman paused while watering flowers. A retired couple sitting on a porch swing exchanged curious glances. Marcus noticed the cruiser but continued rinsing the side of the SUV. The driver's door opened, and Officer Ethan Walker stepped onto the pavement. At 29 years old, Ethan was ambitious, confident, and eager to prove himself. His uniform was immaculate. His posture reflected years of training and a strong belief in his instincts. He surveyed the property carefully before directing his attention toward Marcus. The officer walked up the driveway with measured steps. Water continued dripping from the SUV while sunlight danced across its clean paint. Marcus set the sponge on the hood and turned politely toward the approaching officer. Ethan's expression suggested he already had questions before speaking a single word. The neighborhood seemed to grow quieter. Conversations softened. Curious eyes followed the interaction from a distance. Marcus offered a courteous nod. Ethan returned it, though his attention remained fixed on the vehicle, the house, and the man standing between them. The officer began asking routine questions, but something in his tone carried an edge of suspicion. Marcus answered calmly and respectfully. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, it continued. Ethan's questions became more specific. His eyes repeatedly moved between Marcus and the expensive SUV. A subtle tension settled over the driveway. The neighbors continued watching. Nobody spoke. Nobody intervened. Yet the entire street seemed aware that something unusual was unfolding. Marcus remained composed, but deep inside he recognized a familiar feeling. It was the feeling of being evaluated before being understood. And as the warm Virginia sun climbed higher into the sky, neither man realized that before this day ended, one of them would learn a lesson he would remember for the rest of his career. Marcus Bennett answered every question with the same calm professionalism that had guided him throughout his career. He told Ethan Walker that he lived in the house, that the vehicle belonged to him, and that he was simply enjoying a quiet Saturday morning. The answers were straightforward, yet they did not seem to satisfy the young officer. Ethan glanced repeatedly between the SUV, the house, and Marcus himself. The neighborhood had become an audience without anyone officially admitting it. Curtains shifted behind living room windows. A man walking his dog slowed his pace. 2 teenagers across the street pretended to check their phones while watching everything unfold. Marcus could feel the attention settling over the driveway like a heavy blanket. It was not the first time he had experienced it. Over the years, he had learned that some people became suspicious when reality did not match their expectations. The large home, the expensive vehicle, and the black man standing confidently beside both seemed to create a puzzle Ethan was determined to solve. Water continued dripping from the SUV onto the concrete. The rhythmic sound provided a strange contrast to the growing tension. Marcus picked up the hose and calmly rinsed soap from one side of the vehicle while continuing to answer questions. His patience seemed to confuse Ethan even more. Most people, under this kind of scrutiny, eventually became defensive. Marcus did not. His voice never rose. His posture never changed. He simply continued with his morning. Ethan asked additional questions about the neighborhood. He asked how long Marcus had lived there. He asked about the vehicle. He asked about work. None of the questions were individually remarkable, yet together they created a conversation that felt increasingly less about facts and increasingly more about assumptions. Marcus noticed it. So did several of the neighbors. Across the street, an elderly woman sitting on her porch frowned slightly as she observed the interaction. Something about it made her uncomfortable, though she could not fully explain why. Marcus finally set the hose down and looked directly at Ethan. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet curiosity. He wondered whether the officer realized how much of the conversation was being shaped by impressions rather than evidence. Ethan remained convinced he was simply doing his job. That belief made the situation more complicated, not less. The most difficult misunderstandings often come from people who genuinely think they are acting correctly. A light breeze moved through the neighborhood, rustling tree branches overhead. Sunlight reflected across the SUV's clean surface. The peaceful Saturday atmosphere felt increasingly distant. Yet Marcus refused to allow frustration to take control. He remembered lessons taught by mentors decades earlier. True leadership revealed itself during uncomfortable moments, not easy ones. The driveway had become a test of patience, character, and perspective. Neither man realized it yet, but every minute of this conversation was moving them closer to a revelation that would permanently alter how one of them viewed authority, respect, and the importance of looking beyond first impressions. Officer Ethan Walker had always trusted his instincts. During his years on patrol, that confidence had earned praise from supervisors and respect from fellow officers. He believed experience allowed him to notice details others overlooked. Standing in Marcus Bennett's driveway, however, he found himself struggling to explain why his instincts continued pulling him toward conclusions that the facts were not supporting. The neighborhood remained unusually attentive. A father washing his own pickup truck across the street slowed his movements. A woman carrying grocery bags paused near her front door. Even the children riding bicycles nearby seemed aware that something important was happening, yet nobody understood exactly what it was. Ethan glanced once more toward the black SUV. It was spotless now. Water droplets sparkled beneath the bright Virginia sun. Everything about the scene appeared ordinary, yet Ethan continued searching for something that would justify the questions occupying his mind. Marcus, meanwhile, resumed washing the vehicle with steady, unhurried movements. The sponge moved across the polished surface while water flowed quietly down the side panels. His calmness stood in sharp contrast to the growing tension around him. Ethan had encountered nervous people before. He had encountered angry people, impatient people, and frightened people. Marcus was none of those things. If anything, the older man seemed completely at peace. That fact unsettled Ethan more than he cared to admit. He asked another question. Marcus answered politely. He asked another. The response remained equally respectful. The pattern continued. Nothing in Marcus's behavior suggested dishonesty. Nothing suggested hostility. Yet Ethan felt trapped between what he was observing and what he had expected to find when he first stopped his patrol car. A light wind carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed softly. The ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning continued around them, while an invisible conflict unfolded beneath the surface. Marcus noticed the conflict immediately. He recognized it because he had witnessed versions of it throughout much of his life. Sometimes people formed stories before gathering facts. Once those stories settled into place, evidence often struggled to change them. Looking at Ethan, Marcus saw a young officer trying to reconcile assumptions with reality. It was a difficult process. It always had been. Across the street, the elderly woman on the porch finally shook her head and returned to her newspaper. The retired couple resumed their conversation. Slowly, some of the attention began fading. The neighborhood was starting to realize there was no dramatic incident taking place. There was only a man washing his vehicle and an officer asking questions. Yet Ethan remained. He looked down briefly at the notes on his device before lifting his radio. His expression suggested he was considering his next step carefully. Marcus watched without concern. The sunlight reflected across the driveway as small streams of water rolled toward the curb. Everything felt strangely quiet. Then Ethan spoke into the radio and requested additional verification regarding information connected to the property and vehicle. The transmission lasted only a few seconds. Marcus heard it. The neighbors heard it. Nobody reacted. Yet as the radio crackled with the promise of answers still to come, the morning began moving toward a revelation neither man expected, and one that would soon change the entire meaning of this encounter. The radio remained quiet for several moments after Ethan submitted his request. The silence seemed longer than it actually was. Marcus returned to rinsing the SUV, guiding streams of water across the hood while sunlight shimmered across the freshly cleaned paint. The neighborhood slowly resumed its normal rhythm, but an undercurrent of curiosity still lingered. Ethan stood near the edge of the driveway, watching carefully. He had expected the situation to resolve itself by now. Instead, the calm confidence of the homeowner continued to challenge every assumption that had brought him there. Marcus moved methodically from one section of the vehicle to the next. The simple routine gave him time to think. He could sense that the young officer was not driven by malice. What he saw instead was something more common and often more dangerous. He saw certainty without understanding. Throughout his career, Marcus had encountered countless situations where people became convinced they knew the full story before gathering enough information. The consequences varied, but the lesson remained the same. Facts mattered. Patience mattered. Respect mattered. Ethan checked his device again and looked toward the house. Everything appeared perfectly normal. The property records matched. The vehicle registration appeared legitimate. Yet something inside him resisted letting go of the suspicion that had formed during his first glance. Across the street, the man who had been washing his pickup truck finished and rolled up his hose. A group of children rode bicycles farther down the block. The ordinary details of suburban life continued uninterrupted. Marcus finally turned off the water and stepped back to inspect the SUV. The vehicle gleamed beneath the bright Virginia sun. Small droplets rolled slowly down the side panels before disappearing onto the driveway. For a moment, neither man spoke. The quiet felt strangely significant. Then Ethan broke the silence by asking another question about Marcus's profession. Marcus offered a brief answer without elaborating. He had learned long ago that people revealed more about themselves when they were not given immediate explanations. Ethan nodded slowly. The response was polite, yet it seemed to deepen his curiosity rather than satisfy it. A few seconds later, the radio attached to Ethan's shoulder crackled unexpectedly. The sound cut through the stillness of the neighborhood. Ethan immediately reached for it. Marcus remained where he was, calmly folding a microfiber towel. The dispatcher began relaying information. At first, Ethan listened with professional focus. Then his expression changed. The confidence that had defined his posture throughout the morning softened almost instantly. His eyes narrowed as if he believed he had heard something incorrectly. He asked the dispatcher to repeat part of the information. The response came back clear and unmistakable. Ethan's face lost color. He stared toward Marcus, then glanced away, then looked back again. The driveway suddenly felt very different. The neighbors did not know what had been said, but they sensed a shift. Something important had changed. Marcus noticed it immediately. He could see realization beginning to replace certainty inside the young officer's eyes. Whatever information had just arrived over that radio was forcing Ethan to reconsider everything he thought he understood. And as the warm morning sunlight continued pouring across the quiet neighborhood, the first cracks began appearing in the assumptions that had shaped the entire encounter. The words coming through the radio were simple, but their impact was immediate. Ethan listened in complete silence as the dispatcher repeated the information a second time. Property ownership confirmed. Vehicle registration confirmed. Employment record confirmed. Then came the detail that changed everything. The homeowner standing in front of him was Colonel Marcus Bennett, a highly respected commanding officer whose leadership and service record were known throughout the department. For a brief moment, Ethan felt as though the entire neighborhood had disappeared around him. The sounds of birds, distant lawn equipment, and passing traffic seemed to fade into the background. His attention narrowed to the man standing only a few feet away. Marcus remained calm. He folded the towel neatly and placed it on the hood of the SUV. Nothing about his posture changed. Nothing about his expression suggested satisfaction or superiority. Yet the reality Ethan had been resisting all morning was now impossible to ignore. The man he had questioned repeatedly was not simply another resident enjoying a weekend. He was a leader whose decisions affected the careers of countless officers, including his own. Ethan lowered the radio slowly. His mind replayed every question he had asked since arriving. One after another, they returned with uncomfortable clarity. The assumptions, the suspicions, the certainty. Each memory felt heavier than the one before it. Across the street, several neighbors noticed the dramatic shift in his body language. The confidence that had defined his approach was gone. In its place stood a young officer confronting a truth he had not expected. Marcus looked toward him with the same composed expression he had maintained from the beginning. There was no anger in his eyes, no desire to embarrass him, no effort to highlight the difference in rank between them. Somehow, that made the moment even more difficult for Ethan. If Marcus had responded with outrage, Ethan could have understood it. If he had demanded explanations, Ethan would have expected it. Instead, he was being treated with a level of dignity he suddenly realized he had not fully extended in return. The warm sunlight reflected across the driveway as water continued drying on the vehicle's polished surface. The neighborhood remained unusually quiet. People sensed that something significant had happened even if they did not know the details. Ethan finally spoke, but his voice carried none of the certainty from earlier. He addressed Marcus with proper respect and acknowledged the information he had just received. Marcus listened patiently. Then he offered a small nod. Nothing more. The simplicity of the gesture carried remarkable weight. It communicated understanding without approval and patience without surrendering principle. Ethan felt the lesson settling into place. This encounter had never truly been about a vehicle or a neighborhood. It had been about perception. It had been about how quickly assumptions can become convictions. Looking at Marcus now, Ethan realized that the most important facts had been visible from the very beginning. Character, composure, respect. Yet those had been the details he noticed last. The realization left him standing quietly beneath the bright Virginia sky, face to face with a truth far more powerful than anything he had expected to discover when he first pulled his patrol car to the curb that morning. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The driveway that had felt tense only moments earlier now seemed suspended in a strange and thoughtful silence. Marcus Bennett picked up the garden hose once again and directed a gentle stream of water across the front bumper of the SUV. The sound of flowing water filled the space between them. Ethan Walker remained where he stood, absorbing the weight of everything he had learned. The bright Virginia sunlight continued shining across the neighborhood, but the morning felt different now. The assumptions that had guided him since arriving had dissolved, leaving behind questions he could no longer ignore. Marcus worked quietly, his movements calm and deliberate. Watching him, Ethan found himself thinking less about rank and more about character. Throughout the entire encounter, Marcus had never raised his voice. He had never attempted to use authority to gain an advantage. He had never responded with anger. Instead, he had shown patience from beginning to end. Ethan realized that the older man had demonstrated leadership long before his title became known. A light breeze moved through the trees overhead, causing shadows to shift across the driveway. Several neighbors who had been observing from a distance slowly returned to their own routines. The moment of public curiosity was fading, replaced by the ordinary rhythm of a weekend morning. Yet for Ethan, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He replayed the encounter in his mind, examining each decision, each question, and each assumption. The more he reflected, the clearer the lesson became. He had focused on appearances instead of understanding. He had allowed first impressions to influence his judgment before all the facts were available. Marcus turned off the water and stood quietly for a moment, looking at the sunlight reflected across the clean surface of the vehicle. The peaceful image seemed to carry its own message. Some things became clear only when enough time was given for the truth to emerge. Ethan noticed how comfortable Marcus appeared in the silence. There was no need to fill every moment with words. There was strength in simply standing still and allowing reflection to do its work. For the first time that morning, Ethan stopped thinking about procedure and started thinking about perspective. He remembered why he had joined law enforcement in the first place. It had been about serving people fairly, not proving instincts correct. Somewhere along the way, confidence had quietly transformed into certainty. Now he understood the difference. Confidence remained open to new information. Certainty often closed the door before the full story could enter. Marcus finally looked toward him and offered a small, understanding smile. It was not a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who recognized a lesson taking shape. Ethan felt a mixture of humility and gratitude. The encounter had not become a confrontation. It had become a mirror. And what he saw reflected, there was an opportunity to become better than he had been when the morning started. Above them, the sky stretched clear and blue across the neighborhood. The air felt warmer now. Water droplets continued sliding slowly down the side of the SUV before disappearing into the concrete below. As the quiet settled comfortably around them, both men understood that the most important part of the morning had nothing to do with a vehicle, a house, or a police stop. It was about the moment when assumption gave way to understanding, and when a simple Saturday morning became a lesson neither of them would soon forget. The silence eventually gave way to something neither man had expected when the morning began. Ethan Walker took a slow breath and finally spoke with complete honesty. There was no confidence left to protect, no assumption left to defend. Standing in the driveway beneath the bright Virginia sun, he admitted that he had made judgments before understanding the full situation. The words came carefully, but they were sincere. Marcus Bennett listened without interruption. His expression remained calm, the same steady expression that had carried him through every stage of the encounter. The neighborhood had largely returned to normal, yet the lesson unfolding in the driveway felt more important than anything that had happened earlier. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting Marcus's eyes again. He explained that when he first arrived, certain details immediately shaped his expectations. The expensive vehicle, the neighborhood, the image he had formed before asking enough questions. Saying it aloud forced him to confront it in a way that silent reflection never could. Marcus nodded slowly. He had heard similar admissions before. Not because people were inherently bad, but because human beings often saw what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. The difference, he knew, was whether a person was willing to recognize the mistake once the truth appeared. A gentle breeze moved across the driveway. The clean SUV reflected the sunlight like a mirror. For a moment, Marcus looked at the vehicle before turning his attention back to Ethan. Then he spoke. His voice carried the calm authority of a leader who understood that real influence came from wisdom rather than rank. He told Ethan that every officer would eventually face moments that tested judgment more than procedure. Policies could be memorized. Training could be repeated. But character revealed itself when assumptions collided with reality. Ethan listened carefully. Every word felt personal because it was earned rather than delivered as a lecture. Marcus explained that respect should never depend on a title, a uniform, or a position. The people an officer met each day deserved fairness before conclusions were formed. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and sometimes those experiences arrived unexpectedly. Ethan found himself absorbing every sentence. The commanding officer standing before him could have chosen embarrassment. He could have reminded Ethan of rank. He could have transformed the encounter into a painful memory. Instead, he was offering guidance. That realization carried more weight than any formal reprimand ever could. Across the street, sunlight reflected from windows and passing cars. Life continued normally around them, unaware that something meaningful was taking place. Ethan understood now that the most powerful moment of the morning was not discovering Marcus's identity. It was discovering how Marcus chose to respond after the truth became known. Leadership, Ethan realized, was not demonstrated through authority alone. It was demonstrated through restraint, patience, and the ability to teach without humiliating. Marcus offered a small smile and picked up the towel once more. The conversation had shifted from misunderstanding to understanding. The tension that had defined the morning was gone. In its place stood something far more valuable: growth. Ethan felt it clearly. He had arrived believing he understood the situation before him. Now he stood preparing to leave with a deeper understanding of people, responsibility, and himself. And as the warm sunlight continued bathing the quiet neighborhood, both men recognized that the lesson would remain long after the driveway dried and the memory of the morning itself began to fade. The conversation lingered in the warm morning air long after the tension had disappeared. Ethan Walker stood quietly, aware that he was experiencing one of those rare moments that divide a career into two distinct chapters. There was the officer he had been before stepping onto this driveway, and there would be the officer he became after leaving it. Marcus Bennett seemed to understand that transformation without needing it explained. He placed the towel neatly over his shoulder and leaned lightly against the SUV. The vehicle now gleamed beneath the bright Virginia sunlight, every surface clean and polished. The simple task that had started as an ordinary weekend chore had unexpectedly become the setting for a lesson neither man had planned. Ethan finally offered a direct apology. There was no attempt to soften it with excuses or explanations. He acknowledged that he had allowed assumptions to influence his judgment. More importantly, he acknowledged the impact those assumptions could have when carried by someone entrusted with authority. Marcus listened carefully before responding. His answer was measured, thoughtful, and free from bitterness. He explained that mistakes alone did not define a person. What mattered was what happened after the mistake became visible. Some people defended it. Some ignored it. Others learned from it. The willingness to learn, he said, was what allowed good officers to become great ones. Ethan absorbed every word. The statement felt less like criticism and more like an invitation to grow. Across the neighborhood, life continued peacefully. A family loaded bicycles into the back of a truck for a weekend outing. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the air. The ordinary details of the morning seemed almost symbolic. The world had not stopped because of a misunderstanding. Instead, it had provided an opportunity to correct one. Marcus looked down the quiet street and reflected on the long path that had brought him here. Decades earlier, he had been a young officer himself. He remembered mentors who had guided him through difficult lessons with patience instead of humiliation. Those experiences had shaped the leader he eventually became. Now he found himself passing that same gift forward. Ethan noticed the difference immediately. Marcus was not trying to win the moment. He was trying to improve the person standing in front of him. That realization carried a power that rank alone could never create. The young officer felt his embarrassment gradually replaced by gratitude. He understood that many people in Marcus's position would have chosen a different response. Yet the commanding officer had chosen dignity. He had chosen perspective. Most importantly, he had chosen grace. The sunlight continued reflecting across the clean SUV as a gentle wind moved through the trees overhead. The driveway no longer felt like the scene of a misunderstanding. It felt like a classroom without walls. Marcus offered a final piece of advice. He told Ethan that every person encountered during a shift carried a story invisible at first glance. Some stories revealed hardship. Some revealed success. Some revealed neither. The responsibility of leadership and service was to approach people with enough patience to discover the truth before deciding who they were. Ethan nodded slowly. He knew he would. Remember those words long after the details of the morning faded. Standing beneath the clear blue sky, he felt something unexpected settle over him. Relief. Not because the encounter was ending, but because it had become something better than either man anticipated. What began with suspicion had arrived at understanding. What began with assumptions had ended with respect. And in that quiet suburban neighborhood, beneath the warmth of a peaceful Virginia morning, both men understood that the strongest form of authority was not power over others. It was the ability to elevate them. The patrol car remained parked at the curb for another minute before Ethan Walker finally opened the driver's door. The conversation was over, yet neither man seemed eager to rush the ending. Some moments deserved space. Some lessons required silence after the words were spoken. Ethan stood beside the vehicle and looked once more toward Marcus Bennett. The commanding officer had already returned to his weekend routine. He picked up the hose, adjusted its position, and continued rinsing the final traces of water from the SUV. There was something remarkable about the simplicity of the image. After everything that had happened, Marcus was exactly the same person he had been at the beginning of the morning. His title had not changed him. The revelation had not changed him. The misunderstanding had not changed him. Ethan realized that true character often revealed itself through consistency. Marcus did not become patient because his authority was recognized. He had been patient long before anyone acknowledged who he was. A few neighbors glanced toward the driveway one final time before returning completely to their own lives. The unusual moment that had briefly captured the attention of the neighborhood was fading into memory. Lawn still needed mowing. Families still had plans for the weekend. The world continued moving forward. Yet Ethan knew he would carry this morning with him long after everyone else forgot it. He entered the patrol car, but did not start the engine immediately. Instead, he sat quietly and reflected on the difference between seeing and understanding. Earlier that morning, he had seen a house, a vehicle, and a man. What he had failed to see was the person behind those details. The experience had exposed a weakness he had never fully recognized before. More importantly, it had shown him the kind of officer he wanted to become. Across the driveway, sunlight reflected brilliantly from the SUV's polished surface. Water droplets sparkled for a moment before disappearing beneath the warmth of the day. Marcus paused briefly and looked down the street. He watched the patrol car sitting quietly at the curb. He understood exactly what Ethan was experiencing because he had once faced difficult lessons of his own. Growth rarely arrived through comfort. It usually arrived through reflection. After a few moments, Ethan started the engine. The familiar sound broke the stillness. He looked toward Marcus one final time. Their eyes met briefly. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The understanding between them was already complete. Ethan offered a respectful nod. Marcus returned it. The patrol car slowly pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the quiet suburban street. The neighborhood returned completely to normal. The sounds of birds, distant conversations, and rustling trees filled the air once again. Marcus continued washing the vehicle beneath the bright Virginia sky. The morning sun reflected across the clean paint, creating flashes of gold and silver light. A gentle breeze moved through the neighborhood, carrying the scent of fresh grass and warm earth. Nothing about the scene appeared extraordinary to an outside observer. Yet hidden within its simplicity was the quiet victory of understanding over assumption. Marcus turned off the water and stood for a moment in the sunlight. The driveway was peaceful. The street was peaceful. The day stretched ahead with all the ordinary possibilities of a Saturday morning. He smiled softly, gathered his supplies, and walked toward the house. Behind him, the clean SUV reflected the sky above. Ahead of him, the front door stood open. And somewhere farther down the road, a young officer drove away carrying a lesson that would shape every encounter that followed. The neighborhood remained still beneath the golden light, and in that silence, dignity had spoken louder than authority ever could.